Ways and Means, here we are. Friday, March 9th, May 9th. Wow, sorry about that. 2:30, and we are continuing our work on S-127. Have a new draft that is labeled something. What's it labeled?
Draft 1.1.
Draft 1.1, which should be up on our committee page momentarily. John, the floor is yours.
Perfect. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Long time no see. This is draft 1.1 because what we have been looking at before were standalone language specific to the CHIP proposal, but because you wanted the amendment available for basically in the form that you would be putting on next week. What you have now is a draft amendment, so it contains everything from S-127, plus it swaps out the sections that you guys have been discussing, and it includes, and I will just screen share so you can see the language that James shared with you earlier. So that's what you're seeing highlighted there is that section 24 language. But I will jump into the CHIP program. So if it's cool with you guys, I will probably just scroll relatively quickly. You're not going to see a ton of highlighting, but I may hit a couple things just to make sure that we are on the same page because a lot of conversation was happening. So in the definitions section, we have our affordable housing construct from earlier today that we talked about, that Title 27 piece. And then I think what I wanted to confirm on page 43 was that the definition of improvements remained unchanged from this morning.
Oh,
I wasn't
don't
sure.
remember what happened.
Because I know there was discussion around site preparation, but it just kind of stopped. That what I recall. I may.
Yeah, no, that's true.
I think we
Is it because we?
certainly want keeping it the way it was.
That was the last that I heard was no change to this, but I wasn't sure if it was a definitive statement of the.
It's probably the definitive statement.
Were we gonna talk about public roads, public streets and public bridges? We can talk about that.
Just whether you want to be
Yeah.
specific as to.
And say public before each. Yes.
Say something, not knowing, this is not testimony, but it is a story. Sometimes when a development goes in, there's the infrastructure and the roads at first are not public, and then they turn into public roads, but it was all going to become a public road anyways. I just don't know what you do about the story I just told you. And maybe.
I mean, I have another,
Donnelly knows more about.
we're not, I want us to try to stay focused on the, but, I think I also have an example of something that's stayed entirely private as public good. So the manufactured home community where I live, the roads are private and the affordable house, it's 100% affordable housing, and definitely I would consider it a public good, but the roads are all private.
Right. Right. One thing you could do here, depending on folks.
I don't think that's in the best interest of the actual community, but it's the way it was structured.
You do have the lead-in language, right? That's so depending on your perspective, you could also eliminate any reference to public here and just take picking up the public good, but that is agnostic as to who the owner is. Right? It could be privately owned, but for the public good. So
I'd
options.
rather take it out and then see what happens.
Take
I
out,
would prefer to keep it in. I'd prefer to keep it in.
So no road, maybe go with it as it is.
love that.
Just leave it as is.
Okay.
I'll keep going.
On the,
Representative Holcomb?
sorry, question, on the second one, the site preparation, could we add a 3 that we're gonna revisit this and see who's actually accessing this? And the reason I asked is because we have other state.
In the reporting requirements.
Yes. Can we add a reporting report that evaluates how that's being used? Because I find this language extremely problematic.
Yes. Let us add that to the reporting.
Especially given that we have other state programs that do this work. I don't know why we are creating this.
Yep.
So the reporting will include descriptions of the infrastructure that is being.
I think more specifically, I would like an evaluation of to what extent this is being used to fund, this is a use of public funds for private interest.
Okay.
Mine would be more along.
Oh.
Concept.
I'm just gonna let John catch up for a moment. And yes, Representative Bodie.
Good.
And mine is more along the lines of, we happen to have the testimony today about the ANR having money for brownfields. And I mostly want to keep anything that out of this program that can be, that someone should access outside this program. You know,
So
to maximize housing.
a reasonable resource maximizing actor would receive a brownfield grant from one place and then use this program to maximize resources that were not available from some other place.
Well,
That's what any reasonable person would do in that situation.
But can we have a report back so that we see, so that we as a committee, maybe work to get more money for brownfields if we see that there's.
And that is what that would, we would see that in the report back. I think that.
All right, okay.
I want us to, I'm worried that everyone have moved into an expansive spirit here, and I appreciate that, but we need to be in a narrowing spirit in this moment. Does that make sense?
It does. I
Okay.
just want to be sure that as the program goes on, we use as much for housing as possible.
And I think yes, agreed.
Okay. Purpose. We added in the affordability piece. So purpose of the program is to support the development of new primary residences for households of low or moderate income that would not be created but for the infrastructure improvements funded by the program. Jump past this. Okay, the application. So a couple of changes here. And it's all going to make more sense when we get to the end of the section, but how do we integrate the board and BEPC at the same time? So what you see here is BEPC may recommend for approval by the board only applications that meet before test process requirements, project criterion, either the location criterion for which they approve the tax increment financing plan and that meet the submission deadline. So BEPC does all the things that you were expecting BEPC to do before there was any board included in this. But what they are doing is they're recommending to the board, once they've evaluated all of those pieces and said, yes, it meets all the tests here. Yes, we approved the tax increment financing plan, and yes, this was submitted in time. They're recommending approval to the board, and the board does a check on their application, basically. So the board just reviews the application they received from BEPC, and it says, and we'll come to this section, but they evaluate it against the purpose, and then they reevaluate all of this. They say, did you meet these standards? And I'll come to the subsection that says that, but that is the orientation. So you'll see stated here just the language that makes BEPC undertake these tasks. So the but-for test, BEPC does that just as we contemplated before we made that update. BEPC does its process requirements. BEPC evaluates the project criterion. So did they, I'm sorry, this shouldn't be highlighted. I haven't changed anything here.
Okay. Don't let us look at it then.
They evaluate the location criteria, they evaluate the affordability criterion, they look at the tax increment financing plan, and then approval. Here's what happens. BEPC recommends to the board for approval any application that meets the standards of subdivision B1 of this section, and I can confirm the cross references once over the weekend. The board will review the council's recommendation and determine whether the application satisfies the purposes of the subchapter. And again, they would also evaluate, does it meet the standards of that sub 1? So they don't just check in and say, we see that you looked at these things. They receive the application as recommended by BEPC, and then they say, we agree. We do think it meets the standards of this section. The council may only approve pursuant to the subchapter tax increment financing for applications that receive board approval pursuant to the subsection. So this is a little odd, and we may want to think about this final line, but basically the way that I think about this is BEPC is the entity that approves tax increment financing. That's the reference we make all throughout the chapter, right?
I think that's a
We
perfect.
say, so what's happening is BEPC does its evaluation. It says, yes, application looks good, hands it over to the board. Board receives it and says, yes, this looks good. Once they have said, we okayed it, BEPC now approves for tax increment financing that application. And that's the final step in the application process. I think that is consistent with what the group was looking for. But I won't.
Yeah, Representative Lonsdale.
Just which criterion is VEPC looking at before they send it to the chair?
Everything. They look at every.
So the purpose, the
All the things.
oh,
Do you want the picture?
They look at the process requirements, they look at the purpose, they look at
the
location criteria, the
Yes.
project criterion, they examine the affordability.
So I thought that we had decided that the chipboard was gonna do all that, because Pepsi doesn't have the
I
expertise.
think the idea is they're gonna do their darn best. And then to validate that they did their darn best, people with more expertise than they have will check that darn best.
You can write a note and say, you want to get into.
I-
And they could ask for advice if they need it.
What if they fail to ask for advice?
Well, in any event, the board has to issue.
The board has to weigh in, yeah.
All right, all right.
So it's saying, program, you're housed in Betsy, do what you do. Board, double check the work, and make sure that all the housing components for which you have particular expertise are right. That's my understanding of the structure.
It's kind of like a mortgage loan processor, but an underwriter has to give the approval.
Funny, Polly
Really
used to
speak
work.
my language, I'm trying.
Polly used to use the word underwriter with me and I was like, I don't think that's what that means, but it's the word you thought of.
Committee and it's big.
Yeah.
So the
Okay,
group
great.
is working on it.
Credit department, loan committee.
Great.
That's fine.
Okay, it's all working for people. Okay.
Tax increment retention limit. So this is, as Pat was presenting, shall not approve pursuant to the subject are an annual amount of education property tax increment retention greater than $40 million. I previously had a narrative description of, this is consistent with what Pat presented, just to be clear. So if there wasn't head shaking then, then
Oh, yeah, I didn't understand what was being presented.
I think we kept saying to Pat what we thought was happening. I still, yeah, I think there was a disconnect.
so maybe I can offer my read of what this does and also offer why I don't have a narrative description of what this language does. So what this is intended to produce is in any year, a maximal impact of $14 million, which would result in that 1 cent on the $100.
And before you get to that, before you get this explanation, I want to say that because of this, this is going to be a bear to report on the floor. Okay? And so it would be very helpful if everyone on this committee could could try to get their head around the confusion of this and what it means, because we're all going to have a responsibility to explain why 14 million becomes 40 million.
And yeah, so let me,
So let's pay extra attention as John says it
I'll
in a different
attempt
way. Okay.
to my context for this. So earlier when we were discussing a 14 million a year, what's actually the restriction here is what can be approved. So what they're approving is for the lifetime of the project that's being pursued, an increment figure. And so you're not in any year getting hit with this 40 million, right? It's across the course of the project's lifetime,
Which is 25 years.
which could be 25 years, it could be 30 years, right? So the length of retention should be a maximum of 20 years. The financing could be potentially longer. But basically what this figure is a calculation that represents what would result in a year, the highest amount you could be hit is $14 million in that year. This isn't saying in any year you would have $40 million in education property tax increment, because you wouldn't be hit with the full value of that approval in a year. You're building increment over time. This may be something where it's helpful to sit with people, and I don't know if like Pat and I should sit with someone to explain this. But just that's what this figure is. It is not that you're going to get hit in a year with $40 million. This is the number that would, based on estimates, produce a maximum impact in a year of $14 million.
14. Okay.
I'm lost. I'm just not following how we're getting the 40.
Just put a picture together.
It's because you're,
I mean, I can't, and we certainly haven't had time to like.
We can come back on Tuesday morning on this.
Yeah.
morning.
Well, let's pause on the Tuesday morning idea, okay? Because I appreciate that. And just want to check in, if people are able to sort of suspend the disbelief of their own minds, just for a moment, okay? And I'm not saying we should disregard the disbelief of your own mind, just suspend it for a moment. That the idea is that's the maximum exposure to the education fund from this program would be $14 million a year.
Yes.
Can say that.
Yes,
So
and
I'm sorry.
And that the way to describe that for the purposes of approving programs by VEPSI would be phrasing it this way, then I'm happy for us to move on and have folks work in various ways to understand this language and feel comfortable with it by Tuesday. I just don't want to relitigate it on Tuesday. Yes, Representative Maslin.
Yeah, we had the number floating around last week, but could you remind us of the gross size of the education grant list?
Oh, I certainly. don't
Someone
know.
that was in the room. Anyway, I recall it being, always said, well, we'll come get to it, but not right now.
It was huge.
Yeah, and we can have Pat take us through a very simplified table in a
Just a
minute. Yeah.
Big,
Yeah.
little thing. I'd like to know what it is, so people are gonna ask me.
And remember, we got to to the 14 with the idea of 1 cent.
Right.
Okay,
It's equivalent to adding 8 elementary schools a year. In cost.
yes.
I think maybe a helpful way to think about it is if you had this morning's restriction, an annual amount of 14 million, it was producing and Pat can check me on this, it was producing like a maximal yearly impact of 3 million or something quite low. Like that was the projected maximal impact if you had an annual cap of 14 million.
So if folks can hold that premise in their minds, and then we can have Pat we can close out with Pat sort of giving a simplified spreadsheet to us, and then folks can process over the weekend. Okay.
Keep.
If I lean forward, you're out of my sight view, so you might need to.
See where I have highlighting. Rulemaking. So council is to specifically adopt rules to govern prioritization of applications that take into consideration purposes, blight, regional equity and verifiable housing shortages, and labor sheds. What we removed were the vacancy rates, stagnation, and proximity to job centers. So this is your list of, this isn't to say that Pepsi can't consider other things, but they need to specifically consider these factors when determining how to prioritize applications. Purpose of the subchapter, so that's creating net housing for low to moderate income. They need to consider blight, regional equity and verifiable housing shortages, and labor sheds. This is a much better, this is so much better. So thank you. Determine the appropriate, this Bruce said categorization floor area, which was my midnight brain. Now we say floor area measure, which makes so much more sense. Okay, some updates to the board. This is the last piece that I was working on, so I was just kind of madly typing this up to align with the changes that we saw above in 1910 related to that process where VEPSI does its full review and then the board checks and approves. So now it says there's created the CHIP board to review applications for tax increment financing recommended by VEPSI pursuant to section 1910. Same membership as this morning, and the duties are, as you would expect, the board shall review applications for tax increment financing recommended by VEPSI pursuant to section 1910, and the board shall respond with its approval or denial not later than 30 days following receipt of the request. I can change this last receipt of request because they're just going to be integrated into the piece. Do you want
I'd like that to be 45 days.
Okay.
And the reason I'm saying 45 days, folks, is like, depending on what day of the month the meeting happened, like it means that a monthly meeting could account for something.
And that I started to drop in the 12 meetings just to have a monthly meeting. And then I thought it's going to be very obvious to people what this concept is. I'll just pull in the language when I have 5 more minutes. Yeah. That is the full of the changes I have from earlier. It is
I
certainly.
don't think we even need to mandate monthly meetings.
Okay.
They can figure that out.
Okay. Just standard meeting, like treasurer to call the first meeting or.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not hours. Like, we don't serve on it, so I think it needs less.
Okay, that's cool too. I can just cut that. Yeah. So I don't know if folks had it's certainly possible that I did not catch everything from earlier discussion. So if you have something that I didn't pick up, please let me know. The other thing I would offer is just summarizing what I heard just now, to cut the meetings or propose tweaks here. For reporting, there was an expressed desire for evaluation of public funds for private purposes being built in, and then changing for 45 days is approval by the board.
Lost my place, but, and I hate to go back. But page 41, I believe, is John. And
Okay.
maybe other committee members can tell me, it's not in that.
Yeah, so say this one I can't speak.
You know, I lost my place, but anyway, it was talking about, primary residence. No,
Yes.
And I guess, have we talked about the verification process for that? I mean, who's gonna verify that these
I
units?
feel like John's had this conversation a few times in a few places, so I'm gonna defer to him.
So the sole structure we have is through the housing infrastructure agreement, and it provides, right, it's not prescriptive as to the specific method of achieving it, but what we've talked about is that would be built into covenants. So it would be a contractual obligation that they be offered in that particular way only to folks who would occupy as a primary residence. This doesn't task some group of folks with going out and evaluating the purpose, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is slightly different than the housing subsidy covenant piece, where you can have an assignable enforcement, basically, if you would like to do something like that. So you can have housing groups and nonprofits basically check in on that. That's permissible under the statutory reference for the affordable housing piece, as I understand it. I don't, but we don't have any specific enforcement mechanism behind contractual safeguards.
In those covenants, which.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
I guess the backwards way, if you really want to verify it, is there a homestead declaration filed or is there a landlord certificate for that particular renter?
But that would be up to the municipality to figure out.
So you go backwards and verify it that way, but it's just.
Also
Your
debate.
managed underneath the covenants.
Thanks.
Okay.
File a Vermont tax return, because otherwise it's not primary.
Okay, we've been through. I don't hear anything else. Thank you, John.
Sure.
So can you give us a Thank You Tuesday?
I can, well, I make these changes for you because I'm sure I have criteria stuck on.
If you're able to send it to us today,
Today.
tomorrow morning, that would be awesome.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep.
Thank you. I think we're gonna, do you want to come up and take us through a simple situation? Okay, thanks. And then we're gonna say goodbye to each other. Thank you so much, John.
So she's just hitting me the link.
Yeah, I just sent it to you.
There it is. Thank you. Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office. So I'm not sure if simple is the best way to describe it, but it certainly is simpler than the larger model framework I've been working in. But hopefully if I can sort of talk through it and explain kind of with numbers this time instead of just words, what you're looking at, hopefully that'll maybe make the general concept a little easier to digest. How is that for everyone?
Oh, that's a very simple spreadsheet.
Well, so I guess just, quickly up front, the program is open for evaluations for 5 years, right? And in those 5, once the approvals are made in each year, there's 5 years in which the project can basically incur the debt, right? And so what you're looking at here, this tax increment, this is just the total increment associated with the increased value of the project, right? And so next to that, based on the 60% retention, this is the tax increment that's retained to service that debt. You can see here, and so sort of the retained thing is sort of what you should be thinking about when you're thinking about the ed fund costs, right? So you can see here that if it starts its 20-year financing window starting in 2030, that these small, or these yearly increment retention amounts are relatively small when you think of the $40 million cap. Right? So in a sense, what that means is that from 2030 through 2050 or 2049, the 20 years when the increment can be retained to service that debt, the sum of these yearly increments retained ultimately add up to the cap. Now, we don't just have the 2025 cohort of projects. You'll have a cohort of projects approved in 26, and 27, and 28, and 29. So as more of these projects come online, you're going to have more projects retaining that increment. And so this is sort of looking at it by each individual cohort. But if we move over to this table here, this is looking at all of those cohorts, their increment retentions added together. So in here, sorry, I'm just going to come back here real quick. In the first year, the increment amount, the improved value of the project is 1.2 million. By the end of the debt service period, that increment based on, our assumption of growth of the increment ultimately is about 3 million. So when you add all those years together, they add up to, that bigger number, that 40 million. Now, when we're thinking of all 5 of those cohorts together, all this is jumping around.
Wait a minute, you're saying 40 million over the lifetime of those projects in any one year?
Over the lifetime.
Okay, got
It's not every single year.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
So when we come here, what we're talking about when we're sort of targeting that maximum 1-year value of 14 million, sort of the penny on the tax rate. That's when we look into this column here, U, which is this is adding all the increments and all of the years together. So you can see that as we come down, the increments slowly increasing over time. But once we get to this red highlighted cell, which is where we're right at about 14 million for the total for that particular year's retention. Because some of the debt's going to be retired because it's hit that 20-year service period, the increment retained actually starts going down beyond that point. So the reason that this is the highest year is that when you look at the 5 cohorts, this is the year when that first cohort is theoretically going to be retiring their debt. And so the $40 million over 5 years altogether is $200 million, which you can see here. The reason that much bigger number on an annual basis looks smaller is that it's being spread over a long period of time. I can pause there.
Representative Holcomb, I want to make sure everyone understands this, and I think you're gonna
I'm not gonna
talk about the value of
I
it.
was gonna make a suggestion. I was just gonna say, it might be helpful to have this as a handout to
Okay.
whoever's explaining on the floor.
Thank
I
you.
think this makes the case.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Seeing no other hands,
No, I understand this. I'm just wondering if in the language is the 40 million can be shocking, right? 40 million. For the purpose of limiting the annual exposure to a maximum of 14 million.
I think that's a good idea.
so I talked to John in various ways about how we can make that, or we can explain that the whole point was the penny.
Yeah.
I think that's gonna probably be the job of the reporter of the bill, and it doesn't make.
Okay.
But John, if you want to keep on thinking about it over the weekend.
Yeah.
Okay.
So listen up, Representative King.
Charlie's reported a lot of hard bills this
I think if
year.
you say it's 1 cent, and then if you had the visual, then I think it would be explainable. I think if you just have the 40 there, you're gonna get people freaking out.
Here's the problem.
Also, I mean, and we're actually we're the ones limiting it. So there's some balance between people freaking out that we limited it, and then some people freaking out because of there's a big number in the bill, so like, that might be fun. Does anyone have any more questions for Pat? Okay, thank you, Pat, so like, you really jumped into the something, thank you for all your work on this.
Don't do that.
Yes.